Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And I'm going to get started quickly because I'm going to do two things. I'm going to deal with the subject matter, which is murderous children and sexual violence in fairy tales. And hello, Clyde. Good to see you. Um, I want to do this especially for parents who have little young children because there's something about fairy tales that I don't think gets talked about at all, at least not in the United States, and I don't think in the Western world. Um, the idea of what fairy tales are. Fairy tales? What does that mean? Um, some years ago, I was looking into this and I realized that with fairy tales or stories to tell children, um, 99% of the time they deal with magic and stuff like that, right? But they don't deal with spiritual, uh, and particularly when it comes to fairy tales in the United States, they don't deal with the idea of God or a God or anything like that. They deal with magic. And I said, well, why would they do this? Why do fairy tales, why do stories for children not talk about the spiritual at all? The idea that there's a power greater than them that has something to do with our lives, morally or something. And then I started looking into the fairy tales themselves and their history. I was plainly blown away because ugh, they are really nothing. The original stories are nothing like we assume. And here's the thing: some people say, "Well, that's okay because the stories we tell our children, they're not like the original stories, so the children don't know." But here's what we don't understand globally: just because a child doesn't hear from the parent the original story, we should understand that the subconscious, which hears and sees everything, they they do on a subconscious level uh, absorb or reflect, or it's in there, the original stories and all the violence and everything that's there. But even in some of these stories, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, they're in the stories themselves, the violence, children killing people as part of the story. I never forget one time we were talking about the Wizard of Oz, the movie. Dorothy's a murderer. At the movie, what does she do? She kills the witch with the house. Now she doesn't do it on purpose, you know. And then later on, she kills the witch's sister. In that case, she may not have intended to kill her, but she remember she threw the water on her. I'm melting. It killed her. And it is applauded. Both cases they're applauded. Now, um, some fairy tales uh, are based on legends that had a spiritual belief of the culture in which they originated. Okay, so we should understand that. And also, like I say, they deal most of the time with magic, but children subconsciously recall their messages as they grow older, and they reflect those stories in their lives. If you want a perfect example of how this works in adult life, ask yourself, do you know any adult who loves soap operas? And they look at soap operas as if those are real people in real life. And here's the cold part. Some people have tried to live their lives based on what soap operas tell them. And soap operas are just that, they're stories, they're fiction. But I've heard it numerous times of somebody saying, "Ooh, just like on All My Children, so and so and so and so was doing such and such and such and such, and I told so and so and so." It's like, wait, it's not real. In any case, a lot of these fairy tales, their origins, a lot of times involve rape, incest, torture, cannibalism, and like I say, murder. And it's just vicious. So in the early 1800s, these brothers, they were Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, Grimm. And I always thought that's such an apt name. Grimm, the brothers Grimm. They collected stories that were unpredictable and often unforgiving life experienced by Central Europeans. Okay, and they were trying to preserve the Germanic oral storytelling that they thought was basically vanishing. Um, their first collection of stories were based on actual events, and then they watered them down in order to sell books. But now understand, they were originally not necessary. They weren't children's stories. These were stories for adults. Then there was a dude named Charles Perrault. It's spelled like Perrault, or like Perrault, like in vault, but I believe it's pronounced Charles Perrault. And if I'm not mistaken, Charles Perrault, he's considered to be the father of fairy tales, and he's the one that is credited with the original Cinderella, which is based on a true story, which we'll talk about. Because oh man, uh, and again, his stories were intended for adults because back then in 1800s there was no such thing as children's literature. They didn't have children's stories, at least written down. Okay. Now, uh, the deal with Cinderella uh, basically came out of Brittany, France, based on the true story. Okay. One was dealing with the 6th century ruler who was vicious. The second dealt with a nobleman named Gilles de Rais, who tortured, mutilated, raped, and murdered hundreds of innocent children. Let me say that again. This is Paul Charles Perrault, and he was talking about some nobleman named Gilles de Rais, which is Gilles Derais. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's French, so somebody who understands French can probably pronounce it better. But he was a French nobleman who tortured, mutilated, raped, and murdered hundreds of children. So, with that being said, let us uh, commence into looking at the history of some of these fairy tales, children's fairy tales, as they call them. First one we know as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, this story is based on a true person named Marguerite van Waldeck, 16th century Bavarian noblewoman. Now, Marguerite grew up in Bad Wundungen. Her brother used small children to work his copper mine, and they would become severely deformed because of the physical labor mining required, and they called them dwarfs. Now think about that, because now in that, when you think about the first time you probably saw the cartoon Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? Seven dwarfs, right? And they would be going off to work. We go, right? Hi ho, hi ho. It's off to work we go. Well, we never really knew where they was going to work. They just went to work, right? And they gave them the cute little names, and Sleepy and Sneezy and Stupid and whatever. Uh, so that's somewhat based on the original story. The poison apple is also based a little bit on fact because the her brother would a lot of times give tainted fruits to the children workers and to other children he believed had stolen from him. So now Marguerite's stepmother hated her, and so she sent her to Brussels to get rid of her. There, Prince Philip II of Spain took her as his concubine, and his father, the King of Spain, opposed the romance, and he sent Spanish agents to murder Marguerite, and they poisoned her. That's the true story. In the Snow White story, we know the queen, what was it? Is that the one where it's the queen looks in the mirror, says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all," and all that stuff? And when the mirror says, "It ain't you," the queen tells a huntsman to go out and kill Snow White and bring her heart back as proof. So the huntsman goes, but he can't bring himself to do it. And so instead he brings back the heart of a pig. Now Disney, when they did it, they leave out a couple of important things. In the original story, the queen actually told the huntsman to bring back her liver and lungs, which she was going to serve for dinner. And also in the original, the prince carries her off. She's still sleeping. Oh, actually, she's dead because they killed her. Well, I guess what it was. That's right. She's sleeping, and you're right. That's what it was. She bit the apple and that put her to sleep or something. But anyway, he's carrying her back on his horse, and in the original story, she wakes up, because of the jostling of the horse, not a magical kiss. Now, yeah, she was supposed to be dead. Now, what was the prince going to do with a dead body? I don't know. In the original Grimm story, The story ends with the queen being forced to dance to death in red hot iron shoes. I remember when I was a kid, I did hear that version once. Okay, now that was Sleeping Beauty. No, I'm sorry, that's Snow White. And I guess part of me disliked Snow White because of the idea that, even very young, was the idea, well, Snow White, oh, she's so this and she's so that, but she's white. This is also partially where some black boys get in their heads that a white girl is better than anybody else. Okay, now y'all, some people say I'm crazy saying that. No, I stick to that because the stories that we hear as children start shaping how we view the world. And in virtually all the fairy tales, what you got? You got a white girl. Now, one of them, the story of Rapunzel. Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair so that I may climb the golden stair. Again, a white girl, right? But let me tell you about the real story. It's actually based loosely on an early Christian story in the third century. So that would be like, what's third century? 200 AD? Yeah. There was this pagan merchant who lived in Asia Minor. And you look that up, Asia Minor, as opposed to Asia Major. Anyway, he was a pagan merchant. And he so adored his daughter that he forbade her from having suitors. In other words, she couldn't have no boyfriends, could no men see her. And so he locked her in a tower whenever he traveled. Now, some kind of way, while he was gone, she ends up converting to Christianity. And she prayed. And she prayed so loud that when the people in the village heard it, uh, because it was reverberating all throughout the town. And so when the merchant came back, they told him, said, your daughter's up there in that tower. She just praying so loud. So he took her before the Roman proconsul. And this is some deep stuff here. He took her before basically the judge, the court. And they insisted that he had to behead her or give up his fortune. Okay, if she refused to give up her religion. So the father, she wouldn't give it up. So the father, he decapitated her. He cut her head off. And then right after that, he got killed by a lightning strike. she became a martyr known as Saint Barbara, and she's revered by the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that's something you can actually look up. Saint Barbara. Now, when the brothers Grimm took the story, they featured a beautiful girl with long hair trapped in a tower by an evil witch. And in their version, the witch finds out that the prince has been visiting her, and she's pregnant too, by the way. And she cuts off the girl's hair and banishes her to the wilderness. That's some cold stuff. Pregnant girl, she sends her out to the wilderness, cut off her hair. And then that night when the prince crawls up the hair, because she kept the hair and she attached it to the window so it looks like her hair is still hanging. So the prince returned that night and crawled up the hair. And when he gets to the top, he finds the witch. So the witch pushed him off the tower into the thorn bushes, which broke his fall, but the thorns stabbed his eyes out. So now he's blind. That's the way that story ended. I'm like, what? Yeah, yeah, that's a real pleasant story for children. Uh, that's like uh, Romeo and Juliet. You know, Romeo and Juliet's been done, I don't know, 1,000 times, right? But you know, Romeo and Juliet in the story that this dude supposedly Shakespeare wrote, they were like early teens, like 14 and 15 years old. Of course, they died. Now, here's one that I don't recall ever hearing this story when I was a child, but it was about Bluebeard. Bluebeard, the guy Charles Perrault wrote this story about Bluebeard. It was based around the story of Connemore the Cursed. Um, Now, this guy was a chief somewhere, and one of his, I don't know, forecasters or what, or seers had told him he would be killed by his own son. So as soon as one of his wives became pregnant, he'd kill her. That's one way to make sure you don't have no sons, right? You kill the mother. Um, but what happened was Perot was more fascinated by the dude I mentioned, Gilles de Rais, and he was considered a hero of the Hundred Years' War. So you can look up the Hundred Years' War, and he was Joan of Arc's protector on the battlefield. So there's a bit of truth there. It was a Joan of Arc. And after he left the military, he became a notorious serial killer of children. And he was given a nickname Bluebeard because his horses' fur looked blue in the daylight. Yeah. Now he was caught and tried, and in his trial, he described in detail how he had preyed upon and tortured innocent children. And that's the story that this guy, Charles Perrault, took and made into a fairy tale. How gruesome is that? He tortured, raped, tortured, and killed hundreds of children. That's some sick stuff. And I bet you don't hear about that in the history classes. You know, I ain't never heard no history classes about this dude. That was based around a real dude. Now, here's a story when I talk about children who murder. Yeah, you know that story, Hansel and Gretel. Now, Hansel and Gretel, in fact, I do recall when I was a child hearing, like, I don't know, uncles or aunts or somebody, probably aunts or somebody, they would tell this story to children to keep them from wandering off alone. But what actually happened is there was a famine. It was called the Great Famine of 1315. And it killed a lot of folks in Europe and England. There was disease, mass death, infanticide. That's when they killed children. And cannibalism. Yeah, yeah, they did a lot of cannibalism in Europe. So some parents left their children and killed their animals to eat. Now, in the story that we know, Hansel and Gretel, they went out through the forest. I don't know what they were doing. I guess they were supposed to be going somewhere or whatever. But they got lost. And they yeah, they got lost in the forest, and then they eventually find a gingerbread house who belongs to a wicked witch. So they start eating on the house, and the witch catches them and locks them up, and the witch starts feeding them so that they can get fat, so she can kill them and eat them. So I forget how the whole story goes, but anyway, they figure their way out, and they trick the witch into getting in the oven or whatever, and they burn her up and they escape. Okay. Um, yeah, kids killed that woman, right? We have to take their word for it that she was a witch. Now, in one version, in an earlier French version of the story called The Lost Children, instead of a witch, there's a devil. Now, understand, even though there's a devil, there's no God. Okay? Uh, so now in this story, the devil is tricked by the children in a similar way. They trick him into the oven, but he gets out of it and puts together a sawhorse and puts one of the children on it to bleed them. So the children pretend not to know how to get on the sawhorse. So the devil's wife demonstrates it. And while she's lying down on this sawhorse, they cut her throat and escape. Woo! So in both versions, these children are killers. Now, there's a true story about a woman who is a baker. Her name is Katharina Sheridarin. And in the 1600s, she concocted such a delicious gingerbread cookie that a male baker who was jealous accused her of being a witch. So then they drove her from town, and then a mob of angry neighbors hunted her down, brought her back to her house, and burned her to death in her own oven. That's a true story. I'm telling you, these people are barbarians, and they took these true stories and made them into fairy tales. Jesus. All right, here's one. And this one actually has a connection to today in a weird way. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. Now, in the Pied Piper of Hamelin, here's the deal. In 1264, a Pied Piper offered to get rid of the rats in this Germanic village called Hamelin, as long as they paid him a big amount of money when he finished. Now, after he got rid of the rats, the elders of the town reneged on their promise. So, of course, he was pissed. So he enticed the children of the village to follow him, and they never returned. Now, some believe that the piper led the children to the Mediterranean to join the Children's Crusade leaving for the Holy Land. Yeah, okay. And then they would be peacefully converted from Islam to Christianity after the Mediterranean rolled back, allowing their safe passage to Jerusalem. Whoa, that's a heck of a story. And the sea did not part, and so the children starved to death waiting for the miracle. This is the pie. This is how we get the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Now, in the story that became the fairy tale, the village was overrun with rats. A man comes dressed in clothes of pied, P-I-E-D, And I didn't know this until I was doing the research. Pied, which simply meant that he wore clothes of a patchwork of colors. And he, promised to get rid of the rats. And he did. And they didn't pay because he played music on his pipe and draws all the rats out of the town. And so the villagers don't want to pay. So he says, okay, I'm going to take your children. Um, Now, in some stories, once he draws the children out of town, the townsfolk agree to pay and he sends them back. There's a different version, though, where he leads them to a river where they all drown except for a boy who was lame who couldn't keep up. And there's apparently some versions of the story where there's some pedophilia involved. Yeah. Anytime you got children and grown dude wearing strange clothes, there's probably some pedophilia. But that's the Pied Piper. Now, see, of course, you will never be able to tell children these stories again without thinking about the true stories. But understand what I said earlier. In their subconscious, there's a knowledge of the origins of these stories, and this is for two reasons. One is we inherit certain stuff. European based children who come up in European based families, they learn certain things from their elders, and certain things are passed down to them. Okay? They inherit certain knowledge. And so when they hear the stories, the modern day fairy tales, their subconscious will connect them to the original stories that's in their subconscious that were passed down. That's why it's so easy for them to be murderers as children. Now, Cinderella. Yeah, this is a deep one here. Charles Perrault. She was blonde and fair complexion. That means she was a white girl with blonde hair, right? And the story loosely relates to the history of Rhodopis. Rhodopis, Rhodopis, Rhodopis. She was Greek, and the name means rosy cheeked. And in this story, actually, it's based on it's supposed to be a true story. When she was a young girl, she was captured and sold into slavery around 500 BC and taken to Egypt. Now, because, and remember how the story goes. Now, think about this. They said her unusual looks made her a treasured commodity. Now, why would that be? A blonde white girl is taken to Egypt, okay? And this is when we get into that stuff about, the white girl is so treasured. So she supposedly was treasured because of her unusual looks. Why would she have unusual looks? Well, apparently everybody else around was black. So, the man who owned her gave her lots of gifts, including a pair of golden shoes. These shoes and the girl were noticed by the pharaoh known as Atmos II. He insisted she become one of his wives. And while she wouldn't be a principal wife born of royal blood, she would still perform ceremonial functions and probably also gratify him sexually. Now, in the modern story, we have the quote, beautiful Cinderella swept off her feet by the prince, and her wicked stepsisters married two lords, and they all lived happily ever after. The fairy tale has its origins way back in the 1st century, where Strabo's heroine was actually called Rhodopis, not Cinderella. The story was very similar to the modern one, with the exception of the glass slippers and the pumpkin coach, and what else? The fairy godmother. Okay? Interesting, they called her a fairy godmother. All right? Um, and in the Grimm's Brothers story version of it, and I do remember hearing this part too at one point, the wicked stepsisters in terms of trying to get in the shoes. Because remember what happens, there's a ball going on where the prince is looking for his princess. And so the two wicked stepsisters, they go to the ball and they leave Cinderella there. And Cinderella's fairy godmother appears, and she magically puts her in a beautiful dress and these glass slippers, and she sends her off to the ball in this coach made out of a pumpkin. But she tells her you got to be back by midnight. So she goes to the ball, and the prince is all enamored with her, and everybody's wondering who she is because they don't recognize her in this beautiful dress and all of that, right? And so as midnight comes, the bell starts ringing for midnight, and she runs out because she got to get back home. And in the process of running out, she loses one of her glass slippers. She hops in the pumpkin coach and gets back home. So the prince finds the slipper, and he goes on a thing of looking for whoever can fit in the glass slipper. So all the women in the village come by and they're trying to fit in the slipper and they can't fit it. Her stepsisters even try, but what do? One of them cuts off her toes trying to fit into the slipper. The other stepsister cuts off her heel trying to fit in the slippers, and they still don't. And um, and there's a pigeon who comes and pecks out the sister's eyes, and they end up spending the rest of their lives as blind beggars, while Cinderella comes, and I guess he either comes to her and she fits, of course, quite nicely into the slipper, and he realizes this is my princess, and off she goes to live happily ever after. Man, this is some sick stuff, y'all. Uh, but this is what the children learn. And look at the treachery. Okay? All right. Now, here's another one. And this is another one that I say also deals with teaching boys some sick stuff. It's called Little Red Riding Hood. This version that we are mostly know of ends with Robin Hood being saved by a woodsman who just happens to come by and kills the wolf. The original French version by Charles Perrault is a little bit different. The little girl is a well-bred young lady, white girl, and in most cases she's blonde, but she has a red cape. And she's on her way to her grandmother's house, and I think her mother told her don't go through the woods, but she goes through anyway because she wants a shortcut, and she runs into the wolf, and the wolf gives her bad instructions, so she has to go all the way out of her way. In the meantime, he cuts over to the grandmother's house, and let me see. In one version, I think I recall, he kills the grandmother and puts on her clothes, and the wolf is in the bed when Little Red Robin Hood gets there. And I remember there was a rhyme, something about, or not a rhyme, but she looks at him and says, "What big eyes you have," and something. And the wolf says, "The better to see you with." And he says, "What big ears you have." And he says, "Well, the better to hear you with." And what big teeth you have. And he says, ah, the better to eat you with. And in that version, I guess that's when the woodsman comes and hears her screaming as she tries to get away from him, and the woodsman kills the wolf. Um, Now she now in one of the versions, one of the early versions, the wolf eats her. Okay, and that's how the story ends. There's no woodsman, no grandmother. Uh, yeah, in fact, she never even makes it to the grandmother's house. Just dead, just dead Red Robin Hood. And that was supposed to be a moral, a story with a moral, which is don't take advice from strangers. Okay, very simple. Boy, they worked that story. But the underlying subconscious story is that the wolf is big and he's black. And Little Red Riding Hood is a little white girl. And so the moral is especially don't talk to no black men because they will eat you. Okay? All right. Now, this story, which surprised me really, because I didn't know, again, I didn't know this story. The Little Mermaid. Now, in 1989, Disney made a movie called The Little Mermaid. In the Disney version, the movie ends with Ariel the mermaid being changed into a human so she can marry Eric. They marry in a wonderful wedding attended by humans and merpeople. In the first version by Hans Christian Andersen, the mermaid sees the prince marry a princess, and she's so sad about it, somebody gives her a knife to stab the prince to death. But rather than do that, she jumps into the sea and dies by turning into froth. Now, Hans Christian Andersen modified the ending slightly to make it more pleasant. And in his ending, instead of dying when turned to froth, she becomes a daughter of the air waiting to go to heaven. So basically, she's still dead. And that's one of those that the little girls, are supposed to love, the story of the Little Mermaid. Now, another major story is Sleeping Beauty. In the original Sleeping Beauty, the princess is put to sleep when she pricks her finger on a spindle. She sleeps for 100 years. When a prince finally arrives, kisses her, and awakens her, they fall in love, marry, and live happily ever after. That's the story. The original story, however, oh boy, the young woman is put to sleep because of a prophecy, not a curse. And it's not the kiss of a prince who wakes her up. The king finds her asleep and rapes her. After 9 months, she gives birth to two children while she's still asleep. Yeah. One of the children sucks her finger, which removes the piece of flax which is keeping her asleep. And so she wakes up to find herself raped and the mother of two kids. The king later kills his wife, who tried to get him to unknowingly eat the children. He kills his wife to be with Sleeping Beauty. Now that's some sick. See, there you go. There's some rape And she has children. He has 2 kids while she's still asleep. I'm telling you, there's some sick stuff, y'all. Last one is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And I know you remember this story, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. In that story, Goldilocks, which is what is Goldilocks? She got blonde hair. And she's out, you know, just, I don't know, hanging out in the forest. She comes across this house. And in the house, she goes to the house and she starts sampling things. She finds 3 of everything. What was it? 3 porridges. One porridge is too hot, one porridge is too cold, and one is just right, so she eats it. And some other stuff. Then she finds a bed. One bed is too hard, one bed is too soft, and one is just right. And she goes to sleep. And when the bears come home, they find her asleep in the baby bear's bed, and she screams and jumps out the window and gets away. Now, the story had 2 different variations, the original stories. The first one, the bears find Goldilocks and rip her apart and eat her. In the second version, Goldilocks is actually an old hag, and she jumps out a window when the bears wake her up. But now in that version, the hag broke her neck when she jumped out the window. I'm not making this up. This is how the stories go. Now, why they changed it from an old hag to a little girl, I don't know. But now here's the thing. Because I've now told you these stories about the fairy tales, okay, and ruined them forever. What I'm going to do now is give you a story, an African story. Only Africans didn't call them fairy tales. They did call them stories for children. Okay? So I'm going to share the story with you. And it's about a famous spider in African lore named Anansi. Anansi the spider. Okay? In the time that all animals still lived together, there once lived a spider named Anansi. He lived in the village with his relatives and all other kinds of animals. Hyena, porcupine, squirrel, guinea, fowl, the chameleon, the warthog, and many, many more. Anansi was one of the village elders, and one day he summoned all his friends and relations to discuss how they could all do more to help each other. Since they were all farmers, they decided it would be a good idea if they would all go to help one individual each day to plow, weed, harvest, and whatever needed in doing in the fields or around the house. For example, on Monday, they would start at Anansi's uncle's farm to help. On Tuesday, it would be his grandfather, and on Wednesday, it would be his nephew's turn. Anansi put himself in charge of this program, and he saw to it that everyone joined in and helped out. After a month or so, he was having a quiet sit down in front of his house, and he started thinking. You know, he said to himself, I think I can see a way to benefit from this arrangement. I could pretend to be really ill so I can't help out with the others, and by the time I'm well again, all the work on my farm will be done. So the next morning, Anansi stayed in his bed, and when his nephew came to call on him, told him, Ooh, my dear nephew, this body of mine is really sick today. I'm afraid I can't join you today. Anansi's nephew told the others that his uncle was sick. They were all very concerned and decided that the next day they would all go and help out at Anansi's farm. This went on for several weeks, and Anansi's condition got no better. One or two people started to whisper, "It's all very well us helping out on Anansi's farm. When is he going to give us a hand?" Anansi heard the complaints and realized he wouldn't be able to pretend for much longer. He decided he would have to do something to make everybody believe he was really very sick. The next day, he called some of his relatives together and said to them, "This illness of mine has been going on for some time, and it doesn't look like I'm getting any better. In fact, I feel worse every day. In fact, I think I'm going to die." Some of his relatives protested. "No, no, uncle, you won't die. No, no, my brother. I will call on the medicine man and get you some herbs." But Anansi told him he was getting weaker all the time and started making his funeral arrangements. "When I die," he said, "you should bury me on my brother Kwame's farm. I have always loved his yams and would like to be buried next to them." Kwame agreed that his brother could be buried there. After all, it's very difficult not to grant a dying man his last wish. Anansi continued giving his instructions. They should dig a nice big hole and line the walls with cloth so that his spirit would be comfortable. They should put pots and pans and cooking utensils in the grave so that his spirit would be able to prepare food for himself. Anansi's relations set to work digging the grave, while Anansi himself pretended that his condition was getting worse all the time. Soon he learned that the grave was finished. So the next time he saw someone approaching his house, he pretended to be dead. They tried to wake him, but Anansi wouldn't wake up. So they decided that he must indeed be dead. The next day they took his body and laid it in the grave, which had indeed been prepared the way Anansi had instructed. There were pots and pans and cooking utensils. That same night, Anansi climbed out of the grave and started collecting yams from the field, which he hid in his tomb. That same night, he cooked some of them. He made fufu with some of them. When daylight approached, Anansi hid in his tomb and slept. The next night, he collected more yams and feasted again. This carried on for 1 month. Eventually, Kwame noticed that somebody had been stealing his yams. He thought long and hard. Who could have done this to him? Normally, he would have suspected Anansi because he knew what his cunning brother was like, but he was dead, and he just couldn't think who else could be doing this to him. Kwame decided to set a trap. He went to see the carpenter and got some sturdy wooden poles, which he took back to his farm, where he poured tar all over them and placed them strategically around his field like scarecrows, except these scarecrows weren't meant to scare, but to trap. Kwame was sure that the thief, whoever he was, would either touch one of the poles and get tar all over himself, or leave a mark of some kind by which he could be identified. That night, when Anansi came out of his tomb to help himself to a few more of his brother's yams, he immediately spotted a figure standing in the middle of the field. Uh-oh, he thought, somebody's watching me. But he noticed the figure just stood there, not moving at all. His curiosity got the better of him, and he slowly crept up to the figure. As the pole didn't stand very tall, Anansi figured it must be a young boy. He decided to play a trick on the child. He crept up to it and said, "I've just seen your mother out looking for you. She said you have to come home to have your dinner." but there was no reaction from the scarecrow. Anansi repeated, "Your mother has been looking for you. Your dinner is waiting for you." But there was still no reaction. Anansi got quite annoyed at the child's insolence. "Look, I'm talking to you, you vagabond. Why don't you answer me?" Still no reply, and Anansi got even more annoyed. "Do you want me to give you a slap? Very well, I'll slap you, and then we'll see what happens." With that, Anansi gave the scarecrow a big slap, and his hand got stuck. He got stuck in the tar. He pulled, but he couldn't get loose. "Let go of me, you rascal," he shouted. "Let go of this hand." He screamed at the wooden pole to let go of his hand. "Let go of me or I'll slap you again." And he slapped him with his free hand, and immediately that one got stuck in the tar as well. Anansi got more and more agitated and angry. "I'll give you a good kicking if you don't let go of me." He kicked the scarecrow with his left foot, and that got stuck. He kicked again with his right foot, and that got stuck as well. Anansi was now well and truly stuck to the scarecrow. He tried pulling as hard as he could, but there was no way he was going to pull himself free. In the end, he was so exhausted he had to give up and cried himself to sleep. As soon as the sun was up, Anansi's brother Kwame came strolling into his field, eager to see if his plan had worked. He looked around carefully and saw that no more of his yams had been stolen, so that part of the plan had worked. Smiling to himself, he went round to inspect the tarred poles, when lo and behold, he saw the figure of a spider attached to it. As he hurried closer, he recognized his brother, Anansi. Kwame exclaimed, "Anansi, Anansi, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be dead." Coolly, Anansi replied, "Anansi is dead. It is his ghost that you are looking at." You may have gathered by now that Kwame was rather naive, and he was also very superstitious. So when he heard these words, he really believed this was a ghost addressing him. He became very scared and ran away. He ran straight back to the village, calling out to everyone he passed, "Anansi's ghost! Anansi's ghost! I've just seen Anansi's ghost!" People gathered round him wanting to know more. Kwame told him he'd seen Anansi's ghost stuck to a pole he put up on his farm. Of course, the villagers all wanted to see this, so they all started running to Kwame's farm. There they saw for themselves the figure of Anansi still glued to the pole. "What are you doing here?" they asked. "You're supposed to be dead. We buried you not so long ago." "You're looking at my ghost," wailed Anansi, who by now was getting very uncomfortable. The villagers too were scared, and they were about to run away when Anansi cried out, "Stop! Stop! Why are you running away? I'm your relation, aren't I? There's no need to be so scared, and anyway, I need your help. I need help." One of the braver men came a little closer and asked, "What kind of help do you need, Anansi's brother?" Anansi replied, "I'm stuck to this tarred pole. Can't you see? I need help to pull me free." Two or three of them worked up enough courage to approach and then started pulling at him. Anansi was giving them instructions. "Pull here, a little more on this side, a little harder here." But one of the villagers who'd been pulling at Anansi's leg stood back and scratched his head. "Wait a minute. This is not a ghost. This is a real Anansi. He's not dead at all." They all stopped pulling and heaving. "Yeah," said another. "How can a ghost be instructing us to pull here and pull there?" They started hitting him with sticks, throwing mud at him, and raining insults at him. After a while, Kwame took pity on his brother and asked him to stop. They pulled him loose and told him to leave the village and never to show his face again. After Anansi was banned, all his family members were so ashamed that they too decided to leave the village. And to this day, whenever you see a spider, it is always trying to hide somewhere, in a crack in the floor or a dark corner, because it is still ashamed of what its ancestor Anansi got up to. Anansi the spider. And as always, I say, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.